Hello, this is Vivian Young with 1000 Friends of Florida, and I'd like to welcome you to our latest webinar, The Coastal Insurance Dilemma in Florida, Who Should Pay? There are two different audio options. One is to use your computer, and that's what you'll be connected to automatically, or if you wish, you can switch to use telephone after joining the webinar. We're going to do a little bit of housekeeping first. This is the second year of our Dr. John M. DeGrove webinar series. We do have a series of webinars scheduled for the next few months, and we will be sending out information on how to register for them. If I'm seeing something that people are having problems hearing me, if you are, please send in a message and let me know. Anyhow, the upcoming webinars, the next one is going to be on the 2014 Florida Legislature, and we'll be providing an update. If you want to get information on upcoming webinars, please sign up for email alerts, and the link is there. It's also on the home page of our website. If you have questions during the presentation, you have a control box right here, and there is a chat box, and you can type your questions into the chat box where it says type message here and click send, and at the end of the workshop we will have an open period where all the speakers will be available to answer any questions you may have. We just ask you keep your questions succinct. We typically have a lot, so we want to make sure we have a chance to answer everything. This event has been approved just the other day for 1.5 AICPCM legal credits. It was approved for 1 credit for certified floodplain managers. We have been in touch with the Florida Bar. We applied for CLE credits, and we have not heard the status on that. We were not approved for CEHP credits for environmental health professionals. The PowerPoint is available for downloading on our website. If you go to 1000friendsofflorida.org, on the home page, you'll see the Coastal Webinar PowerPoint under the What's New scrolling bar. Just a little bit about 1000 Friends of Florida. We're a 501c3 not-for-profit membership organization founded in 1986. We really focus on saving special places and building better communities. We are very active during the legislative session, and encourage you to sign up for alerts for that as well. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. I did want to let you know that we have had a number of technical problems with this webinar. We have switched over from GoToWebinar to GoToTraining, and we know some of you may have had a lot of difficulty registering. We have been in touch and are trying to work it out. If anybody has been charged more than once for this webinar, please check your credit card receipts and let us know, and we will be happy to refund it, and we really appreciate your patience with us. It's been a learning curve for us, and as I said, GoToWebinar and GoToTraining have been having a lot of technical problems lately. At this point, I would like to turn it over to Charles Pattison, who is going to talk about why 1000 Friends of Florida is concerned about the coastal insurance issue. Charles, can you hear me?
Yeah, thanks, Vivian. This is Charles Pattison. I'm president of 1000 Friends of Florida. We've got 3 reasons that you see here on the slide for why we're interested in and concerned about the whole coastal insurance issue, and that deals with the development patterns on the coast, the impacts to environmental resources, and additionally the economic consequences for our taxpayers here in Florida. If you go to the next slide, you'll see reference to the coastal communities in Florida. We've got 35 of our 67 counties that are coastal by state statute, and the current distribution of the population there, you see within 20 miles of the coast we have 80% of Florida's population. So our interest has been in seeking some reform to the current policies. We think there are subsidies that are not appropriate that are involved with some of these coastal issues. There are substantial taxpayer liabilities based on how the state and federal programs have been set up. And additionally, we would look to limiting development in some of the most hazardous parts of our coastlines. The four programs that you're going to hear about today that all have an effect on the coastal debate. The first is the National Flood Insurance Program. You can see there that the current deficit is about $25 billion due to past storm events around the country. Florida has about 40% of the entire flood insurance program in the country here. That's about $475 billion of exposure with about 2 million policies. And of course, most of those policies do have subsidies associated with them. It is interesting to note currently Florida is a donor state, but we know that could change given a significant storm event. The next slide talks about the Bigger Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act of 2012. You'll hear more about that, but this essentially was a reaction by Congress to that $25 billion deficit I mentioned with the National Flood Insurance Program. And you can see there's been, I think, general acceptance that there need to be some major revisions to the program. It does have specific effects here in Florida, and that's another reason for our interest and concern. The next program that's in play here is the Florida Citizens Property Insurance. It only deals with wind coverage, and Don, I believe we were just under 1 million policies now. We update that figure a little bit, but that's still $375 billion in exposure for the Citizens program. And then the last issue here is the catastrophe fund. Most people know of it as the CAT fund. Currently it's at about $12 billion, and that would help pay the state's contribution on federal disaster declarations, and also it serves as a reinsurer for the Citizens Property Insurance. I think most people now know that the deficits that can't be covered by the CAT fund are accounted for through special assessments on all insurance premiums that are held statewide. And currently, if you haven't checked, you'll see on your car insurance or your homeowner's insurance actual assessments to pay for the hurricane damages from 2004 and 2005. I wanted to show this one slide. This is a simulation that was done by the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council for a mythical hurricane called Hurricane Phoenix, and it was to illustrate the worst possible scenario for a Category 5 coming through one of the most vulnerable parts of Florida. And you can see there that the total estimated economic loss, and this was a couple of years ago, was in excess of $250 billion. So that gives you a sense of the order of magnitude we're talking about here. A new program on the next slide that's now going to happen beginning this hurricane season. We understand the National Weather Service will actually show potential storm flooding areas that will be associated with storms and hurricanes. The media is beginning, I think, to understand that this is an issue of interest statewide. This was an editorial that appeared earlier recently in the Tallahassee Democrat. So I think there's significant interest. It's significant to policy people as well as taxpayers. So we're going to get started with our speakers. I'm going to introduce Sarah Owen Gledhill. She's the planning advocate for the Florida Wildlife Federation. She has a 7-county area that she works in. She's a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and has experience giving planning testimony as an expert witness. She has a master's in urban and regional planning from the University of Florida, and she's a fellow of the University of Florida's National Resources Leadership Institute. Sarah's going to be talking about why coastal insurance issues are important to Florida Wildlife Federation. Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Sarah, are you on the line? We've been having technical problems with Sarah. Charles, I think if you could maybe continue with Sarah's presentation.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the speakers, and hopefully we'll get Sarah back a little later. In addition to Sarah, then we'll be turning to Josh Sachs with the National Wildlife Federation. He's been involved in the federal discussions about several of these programs. You'll hear about that. He's previously served as associate with Chesapeake Bay Foundation and was a policy analyst with the Clean Air Council in Philadelphia. He's working on a master's in applied economics from Johns Hopkins University, and he'll be speaking shortly. Our next speaker is Andrew Moreland with R Street Group, and he is a fellow with them and heads the coalition that's doing policy analysis on tax issues. He was previously a vice president for the National Taxpayers Union and served with Center for Educational Freedom at the Cato Institute. He has numerous writings and publications in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and the Weekly Standard. He's a University of Michigan graduate. And then our last speaker will be Don Brown. He's a former legislator and a recognized expert in property insurance issues. He is currently still an agent with in Defuniak Springs. He served on the Walton County Commission, the Republican State Committee man. He was chairman of the Walton County Republican Executive Committee. He's been recognized by the Florida Association of Insurance Agents and the Florida Association of Insurance and Financial Advisors for his many contributions to insurance reform. Interestingly, too, Don was one of the only 2 votes against House Bill 1A that significantly expanded the role of government in private markets. So I think unless we can get back to Sarah, Vivian, we'll go ahead and ask Josh Sachs to make his presentation.
Sarah, are you on the line? Charles, I think what we'll do is we'll just go briefly through Sarah's slides, and she is with the Florida Wildlife Federation, which is a statewide citizens conservation and education organization, and they played an instrumental role in creating the Stronger, Safer Florida. And Charles, if you want to take over and finish up.
Sure.
Thank you.
This is, thanks Vivian, this is a coalition that's actually composed of quite diverse group of different interests, business, consumer, environmental groups in Florida. All of them share the support for changes to the Citizens Property Insurance and the Florida Hurricane Cat Fund. The coalition basically agrees that the Citizens Property Insurance should become the insurer of last resort, which was the original intent, and that the cat fund needs to be right-sized itself. Let's go to the next slide. You can see the membership here. It's kind of an interesting group with environmental organizations, business organizations, consumer and taxpayer groups, and then there are several allied organizations that are complemented with an important field of experts. The next slide was one Sarah wanted to show for the strange bedfellow as a consideration for this diverse group, which is coming at this issue with from a lot of different perspectives. The next slide does show the commonly held beliefs, and that is that all of these organizations want to protect people, property, and communities, save taxpayer dollars, and help protect the coastal environment. If you'd like to get involved and have further information about Stronger, Safer Florida, here is the direct link, and I know it's a very informative website, and I think you would enjoy getting a chance to look at that. We are ready now, I think, then to move on to Josh and your presentation for National Wildlife Federation.
Super. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm calling in from wintry Washington, D.C. And as you heard, I'm the Legislative Director of National Wildlife Federation. We work closely with Florida Wildlife Federation and others. And I do a lot of work on flood insurance, and I'm really happy to get to talk to this group about it. And because often I wind up talking to other audiences that don't always want to talk about the environment impacts, and believe it or not, when I do go to the Hill or other places to work on this issue, sort of the questions I always get are, well, hey, why do environmentalists even care? And then the second question is why are environmentalists working with those fiscal guys and everyone else? So we're going to talk a lot about Biggert Waters on this call, and I'd imagine everyone who called in knows some about it, or you wouldn't have called anyway. But first I want to talk a little bit about why environmentalists care and why this matters so much to the National Wildlife Federation and our members. So there's the next slide. Obviously, we'll start with something you all know, which is our coasts and our floodplains are very vulnerable and becoming more and more vulnerable as climate change is having a dramatic impact, and we're seeing increased storm intensity, we're seeing increased storm frequency, and it certainly is a problem. And let's go to the next slide here. There are two ways that one might deal with it, and the solution that a group like National Wildlife Federation loves is green infrastructure. And again, I think you all know this, that there's no better flood protection or flood control than the nature that's already there. So a functioning, healthy floodplain, the area where rivers and coasts meet the land, is the best thing we can do. And obviously having oyster reefs and dunes and other things like that absorb storm surge, and having areas that can absorb and let the water go into the groundwater, recharge aquifers, and give it a place to go. Those are very important. So if National Wildlife Federation had its way, that's how we'd be doing flood control all over the country, which would be giving rivers room to roam and then developing from there. But let's go to the next slide. What often happens is our federal policy is all geared towards what we call gray infrastructure, and I'm sure you've heard that term before too. And what that means is instead of letting these natural features do what they do, we instead try to build things, and of course levees are a huge part of that, but also how we develop is part of that. And let's go to the next slide. The NFIP, of course, has become a driver for this bad type of development. And again, National Wildlife Federation, right? Wildlife is our middle name, and right away we recognized that this type of infrastructure, that these things that you're looking at pictures of, these are actually very bad for wildlife. And they separate wildlife from the natural ecosystems. They also are more prone to disaster. Levees break. Swales like this overflow. So there's certainly a lot of problems associated with gray infrastructure. And our desire to push towards green is one of the main reasons why we're engaged in the flood insurance program. So let's go to the next slide here. Again, I should make the point that gray infrastructure is also bad for taxpayers, and I won't say much more other than to simply state that it is, and I'm sure my friend Andrew is going to have more to say about that in his presentation. So let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about what NWF really wants to do when we look at a program like the NFIP. And what we want to do is hit the triple, as you see up there. We want to help wildlife, the flood-prone communities, and taxpayers. And we think that the way we want to reform the flood insurance program is an ideal way to do that. Before I get into sort of explaining to you why or how we've done that, I want to talk a little bit more about the wildlife piece because it is so important to my organization and I think to many of you on the call. So let's look at the next slide. And this is an important part of NWF and many environmentalists' interest in the NFIP. So the National Flood Insurance Program, as I'm sure you've heard before, incentivizes a lot of negative behavior. And the way it does that is it charges rates that are far below a market rate. It masks the true cost of doing business. So we see a lot of development that pushes towards the gray infrastructure I discussed before, but also that has a significant impact on Endangered Species Act. And this isn't just a theory. This is something that NWF proved and the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals has upheld. So let's look at the next slide. And I want to talk about a lawsuit that happened in Florida. So some of you may know. Some of you on this call may even have been part of this lawsuit. It was before my time a little bit. But the National Wildlife Federation sued FEMA, sued the federal government and the flood insurance program and said, the flood insurance program, because of the inherent subsidies, are causing massive development of our coast, and they are hurting endangered species. And the first suit of this kind that we ever filed was in Florida, in the Keys. And the key deer, if you're not familiar, is a very small deer, and it's an endangered species. And as I said before, we contended that this program was having a significant impact on the key deer. The court agreed, and let's go to the next slide here. This was a landmark case, and it not only did the court say, yeah, NWF is right, the court said certain things need to happen. And now, when the NFIP comes to certain communities and does its new maps and talks about its rates, they need to work with resource agencies and have a plan in place to ensure that the subsidies or the market signals sent by NFIP aren't going to hurt these endangered species. So let's look at just one more slide on endangered species. And I'll just make the point that this case that we did in Florida that had such an impact is now being used all over the country. And here are two other cases. One that's happening up in the Pacific Northwest to protect salmon and orca whales. Another, again, in Florida, same impact, but this time to sea turtles. So I took this sort of brief tangent only to point out to you that this flood insurance program is about so many things, but for us, it's about animals in a big way. So let's look at the next slide. And let's talk about Bigger Waters and reforming the flood program. We sat down and we said, there has to be a better way to do this, right? Let's not just Tom and Jerry and run around all the time. Let's look at if we can have serious policy reforms that are going to help us protect these areas and these people. So let's look at the next slide. We'll get to the big moment you've all been waiting for, which was in 2012, Congress passed Biggert Waters Flood Reform Act. And let me say a couple things about that. First and foremost, Biggert Waters raised rates on all types of properties, on all people. It'll happen at different times. It'll happen at different phase-ins. But that was a very important reform, and we believe in that reform. Certainly you've seen that it's gotten some buzz, and there's some conflict around that, but we think it's really important, and here's why. For existing properties, when the market signal, don't get ahead of me on the slide. For existing properties, the market signal would say, if you have to pay the true rate, if you're going to be faced with these tremendous rates, the best thing you can do is mitigate. You can raise your home, you can harden your home, but from my perspective, the best thing you can do is you can restore natural features. We can rebuild wetlands, natural berms. We can even help relocate communities when the community is agreeable to that. And without an increased rate, there's no driver for that. And then second, with regard to rate, for those areas that have not yet been developed or that are going to be redeveloped, and I understand that in Florida on the coast there's not too much of that, but when there are those areas, having people, before they start to build, understand the true cost of their insurance is going to lessen development of these environmentally sensitive areas. There were a couple other things in Biggert Waters that are also really great. And because of all the hullabaloo on rates, they get talked about very little. But quickly, let me tell you, we worked very hard to consolidate the mitigation programs in Biggert Waters, and we were successful. And hopefully there'll be a more streamlined rollout. There's not a lot more money. That's a function of where our budget is. But certainly it should be easier for people to get mitigation dollars. And the other part of Biggert Waters that was tremendous is it created something called the Technical Mapping Advisory Council. And that council is charged with many things, and among them, to take into account climate change, other issues, and to also look at other environmental impacts, like what is the impact of upstream fill if we fill in a wetland or something like that. So we're hoping that as those reforms play out, this program will be even more responsive to the environment. So let's look at the next slide. Obviously, I heard a mention before of Smarter, Safer. I think you'll hear about that a lot, but it really is a three-legged stool, and it's looking to have environmentally responsible program, a fiscally sound program, and one that promotes public safety. And I just sort of outlined for you the environmental leg of that stool. Let me go to the next slide and make just a few more points, because the work isn't done, certainly from an environmental perspective. So we need to do more to make sure that this program incentivizes good behavior and stops bad. The NFIP needs to do a better job at giving credit for natural features like wetlands. The NFIP needs to do a better job at not exempting people behind levees to disincentivize that gray infrastructure we talked about before. Let's look at the next slide. Obviously, outside of NFIP reform, that's not going to happen for another 5 years or more now. There are other ways they can do it, and I'd like to mention that to you, which is we could reform the Stafford Act and find ways to encourage more good behavior. The Coastal Barrier Resources Act, which certainly has a lot of area in Florida. It's a zone where the federal government does not provide subsidies if you're going to live there, because they've said that is environmentally sensitive area. So NWF and others are working on these programs as well, and we think they complement and augment the reforms we did in Bigger Waters. Finally, I guess we should talk about, let's look at the next slide. As we continue to do disaster planning, and that's Stafford Act reform and others, we need to keep thinking about this, and we need to keep pulling people back from the coast when we can to protect these areas. Obviously, there's a lot of cost and risk associated with it. So my last slide here is, there is a missing piece to all this puzzle, and that's why I'm thrilled to be here today, is people leave out the wildlife stuff a lot. And we've talked about this, you've heard me talk about this. Obviously, we need to encourage this green infrastructure. We need to have wildlife strategies that work. And we really think Bigger Waters was a great step towards that. We're very happy with it. So my last slide, I want to leave you with a picture of what everything should look like in our minds. If we can make sure we leave room for these guys, it would be great. And with that, it's my honor to pass the baton to my friend Andrew Moylan from the R Street Institute.
Thanks, Josh. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me. So I wanted to, some of this has already been touched on a little bit, so I'll run through parts of this quickly. But I wanted to give you a little bit of background on what's going on the federal level on flood insurance policy right now, and it is certainly a very hot issue. So if you could go to the next slide for me. Talking about the saga of NFIP. So just a quick background. It was created in 1968. The idea of the program was for it to be paid entirely through premiums. And Congress created it because it was difficult. Flood insurance was difficult to write. The risk was hard to price. So anyway, they created this program in 1968. And participation is mandatory for people with federally backed mortgages, so that means substantially anyone who borrows from anything other than a state-based bank. So it's important to keep some context here, though. Out of 132 million housing units in the United States, only 5.5 million are participants in NFIP. Of those, so that's a little over 4% as you see, of those only 1.1 million are folks who are receiving subsidized rates. So this is actually a very small slice of the population that we're talking about. As will be obvious to many folks, the debt in the program exploded after the storms in 2005, which sort of set off these years of debate. If you want to go to the next slide for me. So what we have focused on is reducing subsidies to people's rates because we think that it serves a couple of important goals. The first one is that it reduces costs to taxpayers. That's sort of obvious, I suppose. The second is that it reduces incentives to build in sensitive areas, which Josh talked about. The third is that it aligns risk with cost with risk, rather, so that homeowners can prioritize mitigation or potentially have to move from areas with unacceptably high risk. And the fourth thing is it lays the groundwork for a functioning private market, which doesn't really exist today. So the NFIP reform, Bigger Waters, Josh talked about some of this, so I'll go over quickly. This was a years-long bipartisan effort, and this wasn't some sort of token bipartisanship. This was the House passed the bill on a standalone vote with over 400 supporters. The Senate eventually passed it as part of a larger transportation package with 74 supporters. Of those, that was the entire Florida delegation in the House, with the exception of Connie Mack, who voted no, and Ted Deutsch, who didn't vote. On the Senate side, it was supported by people like Bill Nelson of Florida, Mary Landrieu of Louisiana, David Vitter of Louisiana, Bob Menendez, Thad Cochran, Mitch McConnell, Harry Reid. So this is truly bipartisan. And the core of it, as Josh mentioned, was eventually phasing out flood insurance subsidies for all 1.1 million properties. And that's broken down into two sort of sections. For about 400,000 of them, that's second homes, commercial properties, severe repetitive loss properties, people who have catastrophic losses in their properties relatively frequently. those started phasing out right away. And the rates on those would rise a maximum of 25% a year until the full risk-based rate is reached. For the other 700,000, known as the grandfathered properties, the subsidy remains until the home is sold, or if the flood insurance policy lapses, or if it gets remapped into a flood zone. And these homes were phased in at a different rate in 20% annual chunks over 5 years. So regardless of how big the jump is, you're getting there in 5 years, whereas the other section, it's just a 25% over your current premium. And as Josh mentioned, there's improvements to mapping and other things that were important in that bill, of course, for us. And so I sort of joke that this was the rarest of occurrences, that in a legitimate show of bipartisanship, that Congress made this horrendous mistake of tackling a serious policy issue which made some real tough decisions that weren't likely to be popular, and here we are 18 months later and they're trying to rectify that mistake. If you could go to the next slide for me to talk about some of the backlash. So as you can imagine, there's been a fair amount of resistance to this from constituents who would rather not pay higher rates. There are some claims of really extraordinary increases in rates. Senator Heitkamp from North Dakota cited a constituent who claimed a flood insurance rate of $69,000 per year. For some context on that, NFIP only insures property up to $250,000. So a $69,000 annual rate suggests that they think the home is going to suffer a total loss every 3.5 to 4 years. And by total loss, we mean splinters. So if your house is reduced to splinters every 3.5 to 4 years, perhaps we shouldn't be talking about how much we should subsidize your rate, but about how to move you out of that risky area. So as you can imagine, this generated a lot of calls to members of Congress. There have been claims of impacts on the real estate market because a sale of a previously subsidized home triggers an immediate move to risk-based rates. There were all these anecdotal examples of people purchasing homes soon after that were shocked at how high their rate was. I will point out that data doesn't really seem to bear out that this is significant, the disruption to the real estate market. Even in places like Florida, it's actually very strong at this point. But nonetheless, it's something that got people engaged very heavily. So there are a couple of pieces of legislation that were introduced to delay these rate increases. Bill Cassidy, a member from Louisiana in the House, and Senator Landrieu, also a member from Louisiana, senator from Louisiana in the Senate, proposed appropriations riders preventing the phase out of subsidies. And Grimm's, Representative Grimm from New York, actually passed that amendment on the Department of Homeland Security appropriations bill in the House. And then Grimm in the House and Bob Menendez from New Jersey in the Senate introduced a full piece of legislation to prevent the phase out of subsidies for 4 full years. That had 191 co-sponsors in the House and 30 sponsors in the Senate, so pretty significant support for that, from my perspective, unfortunately. But so it's important to point out we have a 1-year delay of phase out of subsidies that is already passed into law. The omnibus appropriations bill that passed recently included 1-year delay language, passed the House and the Senate, signed by the President. So a 1-year delay of phasing out of subsidies for home sales and remap properties is already law today. What just happened recently in the Senate is they passed a longer 4-year delay of the phase out of those subsidies, and now the question is, will the House take something up? So this is kind of where the debate is now. I actually just got back from a meeting on Capitol Hill with some staff about what they anticipate on that front, and it sounds like there's going to be some sort of an effort to address this in the House. Our hope is that it's along the lines of an amendment that Senator Toomey proposed in the Senate that would replace the so-called home sale cliff with a phase-out cap of 25% per year, and would slow the phase-out somewhat for remapped homes by transitioning them also to a phase-out cap of 25% per year. And what they did is they paid for that by a surcharge on flood insurance policy holders, and a higher one for high-income households. So trying to contain the costs within the program, which we think is important because it's already over $24 billion in debt. If you could go to the next slide for me. So future action at this point. The House Financial Services Committee, until today, I thought was likely to take up the issue in coming weeks. It sounds as though that actually is uncertain at this point. It may be something that is not actually a product of the House Financial Services Committee. But in any case, the structure of that is really completely unknown at this point. It sounds like there will be an announcement from Leader Cantor today about what that is going to look like. But the bottom line is that there is some sort of substantial interest on this, and so I think it's likely to be some action. So just to wrap up, I'll talk about our focus, and you can go to the last slide so people have my contact info, but our focus on this as a conservative organization, the R Street Institute, we believe in free markets and trying to address that. We're fighting back against what we see as these unproductive 4-year delays. We'd like to keep everyone on the trajectory to paying full risk-based rates so that the program can eventually be sustainable so that we can phase out these subsidies. But we've also tried to provide some legitimate substantive policy responses to these affordability concerns. Some of that is slowing down phase-ins or trying to address issues in places like Louisiana where they have decommissioned levees that do not count for the purposes of FEMA's rate setting as providing any kind of flood protection, which is obviously silly. They should get some sort of credit for those flood control structures. So trying to provide some legitimate responses to address the concerns that people have while keeping everybody on the trajectory to risk-based rates is our focus. In that process, we're demanding more data from FEMA and a lot of activism here in Washington to try to educate people about these issues because it's a very complex and in some ways confusing thing. So we're doing our best to inform folks. So that's my pitch. Happy to answer questions later. Thanks.
Okay. This is Don Brown, and I want to say right up front, it will be obvious to you that most of the slides that I'm going to use are borrowed from published public sources with permission, and at this point, at this moment, I feel a little bit like a mosquito in a nudist colony. I've got many, many targets that I want to hit in a very brief time before I get the SWAT. So I'll just jump right in, and I want to talk particularly about, maybe in the weeds a little bit, about the market in Florida, and specifically what we have done historically to address that. To cope with this extraordinary risk that we take living in paradise. I'm going to share with you some statistics. You see them there, but before I launch into that, I just briefly will say this. Florida historically, or in more recent times, has chosen a strategy that I believe is short-sighted, and that strategy is because of the true cost of the potential for hurricanes and floods and that sort of thing in Florida. We don't really want to pay for that right now. We would rather pay for that later. Maybe get somebody else to pay for it. So the strategy that the legislature adopted in 2007 was simply to pay for catastrophic losses when they happen after the fact by assessing everybody and not just those people who live in the most dangerous places. So we've adopted a debt method of paying for losses rather than a capital method of paying for losses. But why is it such a big problem in Florida? This slide tells you that over the past 30 years, Florida has accounted for the largest share of catastrophic losses in the U.S. No one else really comes that close. Texas, of course, is there in the mix, and Louisiana, but Florida dwarfs them to a large extent. Florida is the most costly state for catastrophic losses, with over $67 billion in insured losses over the past 30 years. Total of $467.5 billion, which is an average of $16.6 billion per year, or $1.3 billion per month. That sort of puts it in perspective, I think. Next slide, please. This slide basically illustrates what would happen today if we had some of the historical storms of our past, if they were to reoccur. Storms that hit in the past, long ago, had less property and businesses to damage. So simply adjusting their actual claims for inflation doesn't capture their destructive power. Interesting, when you look at this, most people have forgotten the 1926 Miami hurricane, which if it were to occur today over the same track as in 1926, it would produce losses in the neighborhood of $125 billion. The 1928 Mid-Florida storm, $65 billion. Andrew, if it were to reoccur today, would produce over $50 billion, it's estimated. This is primarily due to the fact that, of course, inflation has had an impact, but it's the extraordinary amount of building that we've done in very sensitive coastal areas. So we must recognize that we're setting ourselves up for serious problems in the future if we continue to want to develop our coastline and do it on credit or do it with debt financing after the fact so that we dull or blunt the pain of our current poor decisions. Our next slide basically talks about the size, the magnitude of the problem. In 2007, Florida was ranked #1 in the most exposed state to hurricane loss at about $2.4 trillion in exposure. You'll notice that, interestingly, New York is second to Florida. The big difference is that in New York they generally don't have as many landfalling tropical storms and hurricanes. Of course, they may want to argue with us because of Sandy, but historically they have far fewer. When you look at Texas, our Gulf Coast neighbors, Louisiana, North Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, and so on, you'll see that Florida really is in a league of its own when it comes to our insured coastal exposure. We are the most exposed in the world, actually. And our next slide basically talks about the result of that. This slide illustrates the top 10 most expensive and least expensive states for homeowners insurance. So I would submit to you that the problem in Florida is not so much a function of Florida law. It's a function of the fact that we are the most exposed area in the world when it comes to tropical storms and hurricanes, tropical cyclones. As you'll notice, Florida is second only to Louisiana in the average homeowner's premium. If you'll notice, that kind of correlates with the chart that we saw previously with regard to what our total exposure is. Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi are all understandable. Oklahoma, I don't know why that's the case. Alabama, we understand, and so forth. And interestingly enough, Idaho, Oregon, Utah, Wisconsin, Washington, those places that tend to be more interior have a more competitive homeowners market there. Our next slide is going to try to give you an overview of the public company that has been created in Florida to cover, it was originally intended to be an insurer of last resort, and that is Citizens, Citizens Property Insurance Corporation. It is a state-created tax-exempt government entity that was established principally to provide property insurance for those folks who were just unable to get the coverage in the primary market. Now, it has become far more than that. Its mission or goals were expanded significantly in 2007 to not only be an insurer of last resort, but to be an insurer with competitive rates so that there was an incentive actually to get your coverage with Citizens and let your brethren around the state pick up the tab after a loss if you had a loss. It was actually the result of the merger of two previous residual markets, and you can think of Citizens really as two different companies. you may even want to choose to think about it as three, but there are three accounts. There's the personal lines account that tends to be the homeowners that you think of normally that are not necessarily right on the coast. Then there's the commercial lines account, which is the multi-peril type policies that cover some commercial risk. And then there's a separate account that they keep their books separately on, and it's called the coastal account. It was formerly known as the high risk account. And it predominantly is those risks that are very close in proximity to the coast. And in many cases, those policies provided by Citizens in the coastal account are policies that cover wind coverage only. The next slide talks about the policy growth, the policy count growth. This is important, I think, for every one of us, not only as a measure of how many policies we have in our coastal areas, but it's also a measure of how well we're doing as far as the economic impact that would result after a loss. And you can see that the blue bar talks about the policy count. And back in 2004, there were some 873,000 policies in Citizens. And you can see how that ran up after the storms of 04 and 05. In 2006 and 2007, it reached as many as 1.3 million. Everybody, including public policymakers, understand that it's very important that we try to get that number down. This represents an enormous exposure, not only to those insureds that have their coverage with Citizens, but it represents an enormous exposure to all of the rest of us because of this strategy that the state adopted to pay for part of the cost of hurricanes after the fact through assessments on everyone. You'll notice that the policy count has been declining since 2011, and it was alluded to earlier today. Some media reports are reporting that the policy count now is down just slightly under 1 million due to some reforms that have been passed in the last session or two of the legislature, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. So our next slide talks about this gives you a visual representation of where Citizens' exposure is, and it is where, you know, we kind of suspected it would be, and that is in our coastal areas around the state. You can refer back to this chart at some point in the future and actually see your own area and see the actual numbers, but the colors illustrate both in the Tampa Bay area and in Southeast Florida, we are very exposed, and consequently Citizens plays a bigger role there. And the next slide, I'm going to talk quickly about the assessments. You need to be aware of this. Even if you're not a Citizens policyholder, there are 3 of them. And these assessments can be levied against each of the accounts in Citizens. The first assessment goes strictly to Citizens policyholders, and it can be up to 15% per the 3 accounts, the coastal account, the personal lines account, and the commercial lines account. So you add that up, and that's a total potential assessment of 45%. If those assessments, once levied, doesn't satisfy a deficit, then Citizens would impose a regular assessment, which is up to 2% for coastal account deficits. And that would go to everyone except Citizens policyholders. And then finally, if that doesn't solve the problem, then there's an emergency assessment, which is levied on everyone, and that assessment can be up to 10% a year per account for the coastal account, personal lines account, and the commercial lines account. And again, those assessments are levied on all policyholders other than workers' compensation and medical malpractice. So you can see if you have a policy, look on it, you'll see that there's assessments on there now. They're small now, but they could be huge. And the next slide, we want to talk briefly about the CAT Fund. The CAT Fund is the other state-created entity. It's been referred to several times in this presentation. Currently, the CAT fund has it's a size of $17 billion. That means that the CAT fund is being called upon to help finance hurricanes up to a $17 billion number. The CAT fund is in better position than it has been in years, primarily due to the fact that there hasn't been any storms in the last several years. In fact, we've gone longer now without a landfalling hurricane in Florida than we have in recorded history. And because of that, the CAT fund has been able to accumulate a little over $11 billion in cash. We have that in our pocket, and if we're obligated for $17 billion, that means that we would need to borrow somewhere a little above $6 billion in municipal bonds after the fact. Bonding capacity is based on $2 billion in taxable notes that were sold in April of 2013. In other words, we borrowed some money in advance. We'll have to borrow the rest of it after a storm. This is the problem with borrowing to pay for CAT fund losses, however, is once we spend the money that's in our pocket, the $11.76 billion for a major storm, then we don't have that cash any longer, and now we're in debt. So the next season or the next storm becomes a huge, huge problem. So we've got to be careful about that. We do need to readjust the size of the CAT fund to more accurately reflect our current market realities. Financial markets are not what they were prior to 2008. As we said, the CAT fund has improved, but it's really not because of the bond market or our ability to get financing. It's improved primarily because our cash position is better due to no storms. And our next slide just gives you a visual sort of reference for how the CAT fund works, the size of it. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. This was intended for you to refer back to. It does bring up one point, though, that you may hear in the discussion as this is debated, and that is that the CAT fund has a retention which is similar to a deductible on your homeowner's policy. That retention must be met before the CAT fund kicks in. And I'll move quickly now to just a couple of things about the flood insurance. It's been covered a good bit already in the discussion, but if we could move to the next slide. The Bigot Waters Act, of course, we've already talked a lot about that. We'll just move on to the next one and let you see that in Florida, all of the Tampa Bay area is really ground zero with regard to the impacts of Bigot Waters. The number of subsidized policies in Pinellas County is about 50,000, Hillsborough 14, Pasco 11, and so forth. So it is that Pinellas County, Tampa Bay area that's going to be impacted the most. And the next slide will show us sort of what our total potential home value exposure from storm surge is in 2013. And again, you can see that Florida is more exposed than anyone else. In fact, more exposed than several of the next 2 or 3 combined. So we do know that the value of homes exposed to storm surge was over $1.1 trillion in 2013. So we are the most vulnerable state as it relates to storm surge and flood. And the next slide basically illustrates the number of policies in force. Florida contributes more heavily to the National Flood Insurance Program than any other state by far, a little over 2 million policies. Texas is next, Louisiana, California, New Jersey, and so forth. Florida has almost 3 times as much flood insurance in force as any other state. Now, we do, in fact, account for about 37% of all policies in the U.S. And the next slide will tell us, this is interesting. As we debate what to do about flood in Florida, there's some questions that we ask ourselves. What kinds of buildings does flood actually protect? And as you can see, principal residences account for about 75%, 74.5%. Secondary and vacation homes, about 19%. But the next slide, I think, is going to be more interesting. This is a poll, the result of a poll. As we debate in Florida now, what can we do about this incredible increase in flood rates for those people who have subsidized policies? This poll was done by the Insurance Information Institute, and they asked this question. Do you think flood insurance premiums should reflect the risk of flooding no matter what the cost, or do you think the government should subsidize the cost of flood insurance with taxpayer dollars? Well, interestingly, about almost 2/3 of Americans think that flood insurance premiums should be raised to reflect the risk of flooding. I don't disagree with that outcome, but the next question on the next slide is even more interesting. It asks, the federal government provides insurance coverage at taxpayer subsidized rates for damage from flood through the National Flood Insurance Program. A new law eliminates subsidies and raises rates. Do you think the rate increase should be repealed? Now we have 55% that says that the rate impact should be repealed. So you can see that the public is not real clear yet about what they want their legislators and representatives to do about this issue. The next slide will show you another interesting question, and that is, if the costs were similar, would you prefer to buy flood insurance in the private market? And they do, in fact, prefer a private market solution. Florida is working right now very hard to come up with some alternatives to the bigot waters. I agree with Andrew, and that is that the private market will likely provide a much better solution for this problem and not the government. After all, the government program is in debt $24, $25 billion. And the last slide, I believe, actually, I've already covered that one, so let's just go ahead to the next one. And this one talks and I'm just going to briefly mention one other problem in Florida because it does have an environmental aspect to it, and that is the sinkhole problem in Florida. This is a graphic illustration of where those things are tending to occur. The reason I put this in here is because some have suggested that particularly in the Tampa Bay area, in the Pasco, Hernando, Hillsborough County area where sinkholes are more likely to occur, that it could be a result of our reliance on drawing water out of the aquifer there. So there is a question that has been created about how best to manage our water resources so that we so that we don't rely so heavily on doing things that will cause things like sinkholes. And this slide just for you to refer back to, and I think that my time probably is about up, so I'll leave it right there for right now.
Okay, thank you, Don. This is Vivian again. I wanted to remind everybody that if you have questions, there is a chat box on your control panel, and you can go ahead and type your questions in there, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as possible. I did want to start out, Don, with a question for you, though, about if you could provide a brief update about what is happening this session in Florida.
What is happening in this session in Florida? There's a number of bills currently being worked on. It is a difficult year because of the political environment, the election year coming up, but that having been said, there are bills filed to reform the CAT fund, similar to what we suggested in the presentation. There are 3 bills in the Senate and 1 in the House that I'm aware of. The Hayes bill in the Senate and the Hager bill in the House are proposing to reduce the size of the CAT fund incrementally over 3 years. We think that's a good idea. There are 2 other bills in the Senate that expand the CAT fund and make it more likely to be exposed. We think those are not good ideas. But we'll have to see where that goes. The bill in the House hasn't been heard yet. Senator Hayes' bill has already been heard in its first committee of reference and passed unanimously out of that committee. There are also a number of proposals with regard to citizens. There's a managed repair program bill that with regard to sinkholes. And then there is an omnibus bill that covers a lot of miscellaneous smaller issues with regard to the property market more broadly. There is a lot of discussion about a bill that was filed in the Senate by Senator Brandes. He has made a valiant effort to try to find a way, excuse me, to address the flood insurance problem. And someone I noticed corrected me. I may have said a while ago that flood was covered by Citizens. It is not. That was a mistake if I said that. Citizens actually covers wind and other perils, but not flood insurance. But those three issues are moving currently through the system, and we'll have to wait and see where they end up.
Okay, thank you. I do have everybody unmuted right now, all the speakers, so please feel free to jump in and answer. We have a question. How much wealth has been transferred over the past 42 or so years from the pockets of owners of unsubsidized properties to the pockets of owners of subsidized or higher risk properties? So, well, I don't know if anybody can answer that question, but give it your best shot.
Well, this is Don. I don't have I can't quantify it in dollars, but it's an excellent question. It's an insightful question, and it's one that has been compounded significantly after the creation of Citizens and the CAT Fund, but more particularly, it was compounded after 2007 when we significantly expanded the ability of Citizens and the CAT Fund to impose post-event assessments. I don't know the number. It is large, but I can do some research and see if that number can be quantified.
Okay. Our next question, what is the status of the Florida coastal construction setback line requirements? Don, that might be one that you or Charles could answer. Yeah.
Yes, there was a bill that passed, I believe it was last year, that R Street Institute was primarily the proponent of, and then the whole coalition was helpful with regard to getting it passed, and it basically provides some requirements. If you want to build seaward of the coastal construction control line, it provides that you are not eligible for certain state subsidized insurance benefits. That passed. It is a place, a marker, if you will, in the sand, no pun intended, where we could do work in the future to continue to try to move that line inland incrementally if necessary, so that we lessen the likelihood that someone would be getting subsidies to do some very unwise things.
Vivian, this is Charles. Just another item related to that. The coastal insurance setback lines are done by DEP. I know they have varying schedules around the state. Some communities have never had it. Others need to be updated. We can see if we can get a report on what the schedule is, but I'm not currently familiar with that.
Okay, this might be for our speakers from Washington, and Andrew Moylan, it does look like you have yourself muted. I just wanted to let you know that. But it sounds like there's just a bunch of talk in Congress about restoring the subsidy. And they're saying if you are one of the people having to pay these premiums, you understand how important this issue is. Does anybody have any responses to that?
Yeah, this is Andrew. I think that I'm sensitive to the concerns that people have who live in coastal communities and feel like they've played by the rules and they've got a mortgage and they pay their flood insurance, and now they're seeing huge rate increases and they're frustrated about that. But I think we have to keep in mind sort of the overall context here, that what we're talking about are people who live in very risky areas and face a tremendous amount of peril should a storm come in, which obviously in Florida, as Don pointed out, is something that's a virtual certainty in the next few years, especially given how lucky Florida has been to escape major storms in recent years. So we're talking about subsidizing people to live in very risky areas, and that's, I don't mean to be flippant about this because it's important, but this is the kind of thing that this is why we see people being plucked off their roofs with helicopters, because we have for decades sent them a price signal that says that it is cheaper and less risky to live in a certain area than it really is. And obviously there are the other kind of dollars and cents concerns about the fact that the program is so in debt and trying to put it on a sustainable course. But just from a human perspective, yes, it is true that there are costs that are associated with phasing out these subsidies, but the reason is that people face a tremendous amount of risk, and that it's irresponsible for the federal government to spend tens of thousands of dollars, in some cases individually, subsidizing people to live in the face of such risk.
And I would add too, Vivian, that one of the reasons why I think it's important that the Florida legislature is currently debating creating an environment where private insurers may want to take some of this risk is that the $24 or $25 billion that the NFIP program, FEMA, owes to the U.S. Treasury is screaming at us, telling us that they haven't managed that program very well. And I would suggest to you that in those extreme examples that you may hear in the media about someone used to pay $400 and now they pay $4,000, or someone used to pay $1,000 and now they're going to be paying $29,000 or something like that, I am not confident that the way that the National Flood Insurance Program is managed is an accurate reflection of what the real risks are in those examples that are cited. It just doesn't make sense that somebody would pay $69,000 for flood insurance, and when that would pay for their home every 3.5 years if they haven't been flooded in 20 years. My point is that the federal government hasn't done a very good job of this program. They've charged a lot of people too much. They've charged some people too little, or they've charged a lot of people too much, and not many people not enough. And I believe the private sector can do better. I believe they can find those instances where the NFIP new rates are excessive, where they can provide solutions far less than those exorbitant rates. But the bottom line is the program as a whole is a $24 billion loser right now. And I think it's the smart thing for Congress and state legislators to do to try to figure out a way to make that program at least cover its own cost.
Vivian, this is Charles. One other point I'd make about the National Flood Insurance Program, the original premise was that by issuing the insurance and having some standards for flood proofing, primarily elevation, that the ultimate cost of a disaster would be less, and the overall effect would, be a better impact on taxpayers. And what we're clearly seeing is that is absolutely not the case. That's why you're seeing the demand for reform today.
I'd like to make a point here, which is, we're seeing, back to the original question, which was Congress seems to want to go back to the subsidies, and that's true. That is what they want to do, but that's a very short-sighted approach, and there are other things Congress could be doing. They could be funneling mitigation dollars so people never hit those rates. They could be reforming Stafford Act, but also municipalities and communities and states can do things. We saw a bill in the Florida legislature to take money and to create a fund specifically for mitigation as a result of the Biggert Waters rate increase. Post-Sandy in New York, we've seen them use community development block grant money to mitigate because they want to keep insurance rates lower for people. And I think for a congressman to simply say, you should charge this rate or not charge this rate, is very myopic and missing a lot more pieces to this puzzle.
Okay, thank you. We seem to be getting a lot of feedback here. Let me see if I can adjust that. But in the meantime, I want to remind people, if you have questions, there is a chat panel on your control panel that you can use to do that. I also wanted to remind people that this has been approved for AICPCM legal credits and 1 credit for certified floodplain managers. We have applied for CLE credits for Florida attorneys but haven't heard back yet. We will post it on our site when we do hear. It was not approved for CEHP credits for environmental planners in Florida. We do have another question in. Are national flood insurance policy dollars paying for public infrastructure in southeast coastal areas such as South Beach, where repetitive flooding is increasing with sea level rise?
So,
This is Andrew. The quick answer to that question is no. That NFIP covers insured losses for individual property. So most of the sort of infrastructure stuff that you're talking about is paid for out of other funds, and that's, every time we have one of these disaster supplementals that passes, $50, $60 billion a pop, it seems, every time we have a major storm. That's what a lot of those dollars are going for. So not NFIP specifically, but certainly a lot of taxpayer dollars that are building up infrastructure in areas that have a lot of risk, and certainly that risk is made worse by.
Okay. And a question, what makes up the $24 billion loss that's been talked about?
Well, most of what makes that up is are the major storms of Katrina, Rita, Wilma, and Sandy. That there were, the subsidized rates, people who were paying rates that were much lower in some cases than they would have been if they were paying the full risk-based rate. That's what has generated that shortfall. And the problem that NFIP has is not just that it is in debt. The problem is that it has no reasonable prospects for retiring that debt. They haven't even made any payments on the principal of that debt in several years. And so the program is at its very core unsustainable because of the fact that it charges these heavily subsidized rates to many people who live in the riskiest areas and are the ones who are going to have large costs when you have a major storm. So that's why Congress passed the Bigger Waters reform in the first place. Is at that point it was $18 billion in debt, and they said, listen, this program's unsustainable. We need to put it on a course where people are paying the full risk-based rate. That sends the right incentives to people. It doesn't do as much to, subsidize environmental destruction, et cetera. And of course, now we're seeing the pushback.
This is a follow-up. Can you summarize some of the ways that both individuals and communities can mitigate the impacts of Bigger's water, specifically in Florida?
Well, this is Josh, and I think the best way to mitigate, again, is to use the various, pre-disaster mitigation funds from the federal government, combined with state funds to, when possible, use green infrastructure, and when not possible, use gray infrastructure. And also at the low, at the personal level, to elevate your home, to elevate your hot water heater, and sort of the tried and true practices.
Charles, I was wondering, can you follow up on, in Florida, some of the land use and planning strategies that should be being looked at to deal with this issue?
Well, I think part of that is a program that the Department of Economic Opportunity has on coastal resiliency. Julie Dennis works full-time on that program around the state. It makes, goes into different communities and helps them do assessments of where their most vulnerable structures and infrastructure are. And just like Josh was suggesting, there's some green mitigation ideas as well as some gray ones to help communities deal with the climate change, sea level rise, and storm activity. I don't know that there is a standard list that every community would look at. My understanding is that it's kind of a compilation of best practices that are discussed, and each community makes its own choices that fit it best.
Okay. One person wants to know if there's any statistics for flood insurance payouts comparing Florida to the United States. Don, I don't know if that was in one of the slides that you had.
Ask that question again.
Are there any statistics for flood insurance payouts comparing Florida to the United States as a whole? This is dealing with flood insurance.
Yes, and that may have been on one of the slides, but it is information that would be pretty easy to obtain. I will see if I can find the source for that, and maybe you can post a note after the webinar on the source for it. But off the top of my head, I don't know exactly where to tell you to go, but it's out there in the public domain, and it would be pretty easy to find.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. A recent New York Times article described Miami doomed by sea level rise because the water would unstoppably come in through the Everglades and up through the limestone ground. Will the National Flood Insurance Program cover this loss?
I don't believe anyone short of God himself could cover that kind of a loss. This question, though, is a good one because it should force us to rethink long term about the wisdom of messing too much with Mother Nature. There's no way that the National Flood Insurance Program would have the ultimate resources to pay for that, but it does bring our attention to the fact that we need to be thinking more long-term about coastal construction and coastal development.
Does anyone else have anything to add on that question? Okay. We have another question. Has anyone considered the impacts of foreclosures, the banking the banking community and local economies if flood insurance subsidies are eliminated? So what is the other side of the equation, I guess, is what the question is.
This is Andrew. I don't have any kind of specific numbers on that. The one thing I would say is the actual sort of demonstrated impacts to the real estate market at this point seem to be relatively small, and they are, as you might imagine, in some of the riskiest communities around. And so the universe of homes that are going from some extraordinarily heavily subsidized rate of a few $100s to several $1,000s, and are not going to be able to afford that to the point where they would have to go into foreclosure is exceedingly small. And you have to balance the interests of those homeowners, those property owners, against the interests of the rest of the participants in the National Flood Insurance Program, the other 4 million plus people who are not recipients of subsidies at all, and the other 125 million homeowners in the country who are not participants in the flood insurance program to begin with. So our perspective is that we should be sensitive to those concerns, and we should try to address them as best we can by making sure that these are affordable, and but that we can't just persistently subsidize those folks for decades to come, because they're the interests of many millions of others that would be harmed by doing so.
This is, I guess, for each of you. What would be the top 2 or 3 things that you would suggest should be done to address this issue of taxpayers in general subsidizing flood insurance and other types of insurance for the benefit of a few? From each of your perspectives, could you describe what you think should be done? Maybe we'll start with Andrew.
Sure. So I'll give you what would be my perfect scenario. My perfect scenario at this point would be Congress making a couple of important changes. The first would be along the lines of what I mentioned with that Toomey amendment earlier, which is to harmonize all of the phase-in schedules at the same rate. So 25%, a cap in your premium increase of 25% every year until you reach risk-based rates, and to apply that to substantially to everybody, to not just the second homes and commercial properties and severe repetitive loss, but to apply that to home sales as well, so the people who are purchasing a new home have some time to phase into the full risk-based rate, to apply that to remapped homes as well, that there would be some effort to address affordability concerns for people who are truly of modest means. So subject to some sort of a means test, you could structure that however you wanted, whether it's home value or income or something, but that if you meet this means test, if you are of modest means or if you're, if you're poor, that you would qualify either for sort of direct assistance in paying for your premium, or that you could be qualified for some sort of, even more lengthened phase out, something like that. And to also address some of these other kind of very technical concerns with Biggert Waters. I mentioned the flood control structures that have been decertified, trying to make sure that we give credit for those, that we place priorities on mitigation funding, as Josh mentioned, things like that. If I had a magic wand, that's what I would do, and I think what that would do is it would address the concerns that are driving most of this, while keeping the program itself on a course to sustainability, keeping all of the participants in the program on the track to paying full risk-based rates, so that they can mitigate against that risk, or that they can escape it by moving somehow if the risk is so high. So that's probably how I would approach it. But I don't run the zoo. I'm a participant watching it.
Thank you. Josh, do you have anything from your perspective about what should be done?
No, I think this is where you'll find that no matter what interest you represent, I think Andrew said it all, and that's exactly what I would do. So I think there's a lot of harmony on that issue.
Don, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, from a big picture, not just flood, but from hurricane exposure and everything in Florida, I would simply say that Florida has engaged since 2007 in a massive gambling scheme by over-relying on post-event debt financing of hurricanes. And for our efforts, we've been actually extraordinarily lucky. We should not, however, let the euphoria of our luck, or our winning hand, if you will, cloud our judgment. We self-insure entirely too much, both with respect to the National Flood Insurance Program and with respect to hurricane risk in Florida. We've taken it upon, isolated the risk on the backs of Floridians, when at a time when worldwide capital costs are going down, catastrophic reinsurance is available at the cheapest rates that they've been in years and years and years. What we really ought to do is not be self-insuring the risk. We ought to be insuring the risk and transferring it off the backs of Floridians to world markets. Now's the time. It's never been more competitive to do that, instead of the short-sighted effort to just retain the risk on our own backs. So let's insure the risk.
Okay.
Vivian, this is Charles. One thing I'd like to suggest, I think part of this conversation actually needs to be expanded. And what I would say is that the Federal Stafford Act, which is the thing that triggers, a federal disaster declaration and helps communities overcome, any kind of natural disaster, needs to really be something that reflects the kind of mitigation ideas I think Josh mentioned, that states need to be held accountable for doing better, disaster planning up front. And as some of Don's figures shows, as much as this is a critical issue for Florida taxpayers, the federal government is actually heavily engaged in this as well. As I recall, the typical Stafford Act declaration, when the president declares a formal disaster area, I believe that means that the federal government provides about 75% of the funding, that's immediately needed to help, with disaster recovery. That's quite a tab given some of the exposure figures we've seen. I just think that program needs to be brought into the discussion while we're having this on coastal insurance.
Okay, thank you. We have another question that is that we should be looking at continuing flood subsidies for units that pre-existed the Biggert Waters Act. They're saying that this is the largest investment that many of these people will have made, and they're having the welcome mat pulled out from under them, and they're likely to only be able to resell their homes at a major loss. So it's asking citizens to finance federal deficits. And I know this has been talked about, but I just wondered if there was any discussion at all about pre-existing units.
This is Andrew. I mean, what that essentially is saying is that we should just subsidize essentially every one of these homes in perpetuity. And that's not only an expensive prospect, as we've shown the program obviously being unsustainable and in racking up more and more debt as it goes along to taxpayers, but I also think, I pointed this out earlier, I think it's indefensible from just a human interest perspective that we would continue to subsidize people who live in properties that face enormous risk from flooding. And there were upwards of 70 people that died in Hurricane Sandy as a result of flooding, and that's the kind of thing that sadly I think we would be complicit in if we continue these subsidies. And so it's not just a dollars and cents issue; it really is a human safety and risk issue too. And I think we need to keep that in mind. Even as we look at the sort of the balance sheet here, we got to think about the people that are at risk too and how we can best help them. And I don't think the best way to help them is just to continue cutting checks so that they can live in very risky areas.
To follow up on that, Charles had a slide about the National Weather Service. This hurricane season, they're going to start showing flood maps as well to show the potential flood threats. And I'm assuming you all think this is a positive thing in terms of public safety, but also education. Does anybody have any comments on that?
Vivian, this is Charles. Just a quick comment. Whatever else is going on, there are pretty much agreed upon measurements showing sea level rise is happening, while everything else is going on. And what that tends to do is to make the storm surges, go further inland. So I think this is a critical piece of information that the public needs to see. I'm very glad to see that that's going to be part of the, the hurricane information that will come out when a major storm is heading our way.
Okay. We have about 1 or 2 minutes left. Does anyone have any other comments they'd like to make that they didn't feel they got a chance to address? Josh, do you have anything else to add, or you feel like this pretty much covered it all?
I think we're pretty much covered. I thank everyone for the opportunity to talk.
Okay. Andrew? Don?
Vivian, one last thing I will add. This sort of broadens the topic away from necessarily just coastal issues, but we ought to begin to realize, particularly as it relates to flood, as we build out our communities, as we pave more surfaces, we create many of our own problems. And as planners, and I know that you probably have a few planners listening to the webinar today, I think it's the opportunity for them to continue to do the good work that they've done in the past, and to remind us that decisions have consequences, and there's results from it. So we just need to be smarter about how we develop, particularly our coastlines, but everywhere.
Vivian, this is Charles. I just would remind people to look at that Stronger, Safer Florida website. It's a good source of information, and it'll also keep you current on both federal and state legislation that may be moving.
Okay, great. Well, I want to thank everybody for giving their presentations. I think this was very informative. We'd also like to especially thank Sarah Owen Gledhill, who we had technical difficulties with, but she's with the Florida Wildlife Federation, which has really taken a lead on the coalition and helped coordinate this webinar. We're having some questions coming in about recordings. We have recorded this. We will be posting it in the next few days. So if you are interested in looking at it again, you can do that. Again, we encourage you to sign up for our alerts so that you can find out about upcoming webinars. And once again, thank you to everybody for your outstanding presentations. We appreciate it.